The finale to Christopher Nolan's series of Batman movies, The Dark Knight Rises, is finally here. So let's take a look back at Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. I don't think I need to give any sort of introduction to Christopher Nolan's Batman movie series because whether you like them or not, whether you've seen them or not, you know about these movies. I am not about to do any sort of in-depth look into these movies or analyze them frame by frame. I just watched them recently to catch up because I hadn't seen them in a while, and I decided I would let you know my thoughts leading up to The Dark Knight Rises. Now, before I get into either movie specifically, I'd like to talk about the series as a whole, and the first thing I'd like to address is the fact that these movies are long, but they are not dull. These movies completely pull you in at the start and do not let you go until the end, even though they are like 2.5 hours long, which is crazy. That's a long time for a movie, long time to be sitting invested in a story, but Christopher Nolan does it. He is great at that, and he is also great at telling this kind of crazy story about a guy who dresses up like a bat and fights crime in a relatively real-world setting. Now, I'm going to get into that specifically in just a moment when I talk about Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, but overall, obviously, everybody knows, and the joke is that these are the dark and gritty Batman movies, right? But Batman is a dark character, so it works. But I think that he really does a great job of putting Batman into a real-world setting and making it believable and making it something you actually, truly are invested in. Another great aspect of these movies are the score. Hans Zimmer does an amazing job, and I was really focused on that when I was watching the movies again recently. The music, without the music, the movie would not be what it is, that's for sure, because the music is absolutely amazing. It is so powerful that it just kind of blows my mind. One little issue, and it's not even an issue because it doesn't bother me specifically, but one little thing that I have about the Nolan series of Batman movies is the fact that even though it's a serious tone, there are some hokey things, like, for example, the bats coming in Batman Begins when he calls the bats. Like, I get that maybe scientifically you could do that, but it just seemed a little bit silly for such a serious movie, or something that wanted to be serious at least. And then the whole sort of sonar thing in Dark Knight, where he can see everything, I thought that some of that stuff was a little bit hokey for an otherwise serious movie, and I get that, okay, it is a comic book movie down, in its core, but I don't know, those things just feel a little bit out of place in the type of movie it's trying to be. I don't know if I'm alone in that. And the last series-wide thing that I will address is Batman's voice. Now, obviously, many jokes have been made about Batman's voice. He's got that deep, gruff voice, so that no one can know who he is. But, I actually don't have a problem with it. I can joke about it, and I can appreciate jokes about it, but I often have that problem with these different superheroes. Like, wouldn't people recognize their voice? So I actually can appreciate that they really went above and beyond to mask his voice. And so I don't have as much of a problem with it as it seems a lot of people do, but I think it works. So let's get into Batman Begins specifically. I haven't seen this movie in a long time. In fact, I might have only last watched it before I went to the midnight screening of The Dark Knight, so it was a long time ago. And for some reason, I've seen this movie 3 times, but for some reason I always forget what happens until I start watching it again, and then I'm like, oh, I remember what happens here and there and here and there. But overall, what's interesting to me is that this movie is considerably darker, or the city of Gotham, excuse me, is considerably darker than in The Dark Knight. It looks very comic booky, like very, very dark and different than a real city. I don't know, it just looks way different. And I was kind of surprised by that because I've seen The Dark Knight more recently since Batman Begins, and I assumed it was about the same, but I think it's actually drastically different. Something else that I think is somewhat different is the humor. I thought there was a little bit more of a silly humor to Batman Begins than to The Dark Knight, and both of them have humor, obviously, in them, but I thought it was a little bit sillier and almost like, oh. Something, as an example, is when Batman says to the homeless guy, nice coat, or nice jacket, or whatever he says. Also, something else that's very comic booky about this movie versus the more serious Dark Knight is the plot, the whole plot of Scarecrow wanting to gas the city, or Ra's al Ghul, or is it Ra's al Ghul, wanting to gas the whole city, and I thought that's not silly, but it's comic booky, and I had forgotten really all of that, and The Dark Knight is really not comic booky at all. I'll get into it obviously in just a moment, but this movie is definitely different than The Dark Knight, and it's very interesting because I was under the impression, or my memory sort of told me that they were the same, but no, I think they're pretty different. Now, I would like to just also talk about the villains real quick. We do have Ra's al Ghul. I don't know where the actual stance is on that, but I'm just saying. And I thought both villains in the movie were great. I'm personally more a fan of Scarecrow just because I really like how they did his character and how they did the effect of people under the effects of the gas and then seeing something like really freaky, like when Scarecrow sees Batman. That's awesome. When Batman is like the full face, black face, I don't know. That is just really cool. And the shot of Batman flying above everybody when they're looking up and he's got the red eyes is just awesome. So I really, really enjoy those effects. And overall, I thought Batman Begins was a really, really awesome movie. I hadn't seen it in a while, and I was very surprised that it was just really, really great. And once again, it drags you in at the start and doesn't let you go. And even though it's long, the pacing is good enough that it keeps you involved and keeps you invested. Moving on to The Dark Knight. Everybody knows The Dark Knight. Most people have seen it many times, I assume. I am not the type of person who sits down and watches it every day or anything like that, although I'm sure there are people out there that did for a while. But of course, I do love it. I think it is a fantastic film, and the interesting thing about it is that a lot of people, if you ask them, they say like, oh, it's one of the best movies of all time, not just one of the best comic book movies of all time. It has transcended the comic book genre and gone into actual just general movies to be one of what most people consider to be one of the best movies of all time. And I think that's very interesting, and I do think it's deserved. I do think it is a great, great film, truly. But the first thing I have to say is, like I just said about Batman Begins, the tone is actually pretty different in this one than in Batman Begins, and I was surprised once again because my memory failed me on this and tricked me into thinking that they were both about the same. But while Batman Begins is very, very comic booky, The Dark Knight is really not very comic booky at all, and I think that's a problem that a lot of people had with it because they say, oh, it's barely a Batman movie, it's more about something else. Not to say it's bad, but I've heard a lot of people say that, and I can see that, I guess, but clearly it is a Batman movie because Batman is in it and all that, but I do think that it really stands on its own, not just as a comic book movie. This movie, more so than Batman Begins, although it does have some of this, Dark Knight has so many iconic images or, you know, iconic visuals, but more importantly, iconic writing. If you ask anyone to say something from The Dark Knight Rises, they're going to blast "Why so serious?" at you. They're going to say stuff like, some people just want to watch the world burn. There's so many amazing lines from this movie, unforgettable lines, truly unforgettable, and I think that that is a huge, huge strong point, and once again, helps this movie truly transcend the genre boundary of a comic book movie. I also have to point out that the opening to this movie, the bank heist, all of that is one of the best scenes I think I've ever seen in any movie. It honestly works on its own as a short film, and I think that's why it's so great. Like, you could end the movie right there, and you've got a little movie, a little mini movie. And I would also like to, of course, talk a little bit about the villains, the Joker, and Two-Face. I will start with Two-Face because we want to get to the Joker last. But Two-Face I thought was done in a really awesome way, and that would be the only comic booky thing I suppose I could say about this movie, because, like I said, the rest of it is much more serious. But a guy with most of his face burnt off is not silly, once again, but comic booky. And I do think that they did it awesome. Like, it looks great. It really fits into the world very well, and the way that it happens is great. I love the scene when his face goes on fire, and I think they did a great job with him. But, of course, the Joker is, whether unfortunately or fortunately, the star of this movie. And Heath Ledger did one of the most powerful performances I've ever seen personally. I don't know if powerful is the right word. I would say powerful, I guess, but just he really truly loses himself in the role. And of course, that ended up sort of being his downfall, but it is just an amazing thing to witness. When he first pulls off that mask at the very start of the movie, you know you're in for something very special, and it really is a very special performance. And do we think that the success of The Dark Knight has anything to do with Heath Ledger dying? I say yes, absolutely yes. I don't think that it deserves to have that put on it completely because it is a great film regardless, but I do think that a lot of the hype and the success does have to do with that. But let me know what you think of these movies. Let me know what you think of Batman Begins. Let me know what you think of The Dark Knight. Let me know what you think comparing the two with the tone. Like I said, you know, one is a little bit more comic booky than the other. Let me know anything that you want about Nolan's Batman series, and that's pretty much it.